Hello and welcome to this first 3ds Max tutorial. Now in this tutorial we're going to be looking at basically the navigation panel and finding a way around this complicated program. So first of all what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the application menu, and this is the application menu up here with the Autodesk symbol. If I click on it, this way you can create new documents, you can open documents from, save them, save as, import, export, send to different documents and applications. And you know, there's other properties here for things, but the main ones you'll do here is new, open, save, save as, and import. They'll be the sort of like main ones in the beginner sort of tutorials here. One thing is you can only work on one document at a time, so if you open a document you would have to close the other document that you're working on. So 3ds Max, you can only have one document open at a time. Next to up here we have the quick access menu as well. Let me just click off that. So here you can just go for a new scene, you can open a file, you can save and undo scene operations, you know, and redo and things like that as well. So here's your quick access, and here's your main application menu up here. Right, so along here we have the main toolbar, and here we have select and link, and this is the ability to link objects and things, and you can bind space warp. We'll get into that later on in tutorials. Here you can select which objects on the scene you want to look at. You might not be familiar with these yet, but later on in the program, when you've got cameras in there and lights and geometries, which are boxes and circles and things, you'll be able to select which sort of object you want to look at. Here we have the ability to select objects. That's pretty much like a Photoshop thing, you know, it's just where you can select on the screen and pick which object you're going to look at. Here you can select objects by name, so you'll have a drop down list. I haven't got any objects here, but it will tell you which object it is. So when you've got a complex scene, you can select which object it is, press OK and then go to that. This is your rectangular selection tool, so this is the selection tool, and you can click and drag over the selections and things. This tool is the window crossing tool, and this is how you select objects. So if I press on it, you can see here, if I have an object on the stage, let me just draw out a box. If I have an object on the stage, and let's have two objects actually. Okay, so in the viewport there, and I select the window crossing view, say, and let's have the rectangular selection tool. Okay, and all I'm going to do is drag and select just into it. You can see it selects the object. Now, if I click off that and deselect it, if I have it on this, which is the other option, where you've got to select and half select there, you notice it doesn't select it. So what you have to do is click and drag completely over the object with that. So it stops, perhaps, say there if I was trying to drag, just wanted that one object but it was a tighter scene, I wouldn't be able to select this object here. So if I wanted to select them both, I would just select that option and then it will select them both as well. Here's the Selector Move tool. So if I click off this here, I can click on here and I can just move it along the y-axis, the x-axis, and notice I'm just highlighting each axis here, the z-axis, and if I click in the middle here, see it highlights all three of them. I can do, sorry, that's just the two of them, that's the x and the y-axis, and you can actually get it so you have all three as well. So you can, here we'll have two that way, two that way, and so on. Okay, so you can just select where your object's going to go. Here's the rotation tool. Once again, you can select rotation there, and you can see the angles you're getting on your rotation as well, and it gives you exactly how many angles you're on, the degrees. This is the select, this is the uniform scale, so that way it's very similar to the move tool, so I can select all three of them to scale that way. I could select two of them so it gets bigger that way, or I could select these two here so it gets bigger that way, and I can select these two so it gets bigger that way. This is the view. We're going to look at that later on in the tutorial, but for the moment we'll just keep it on a standard view. This is about changing the pivot points and where we have the pivot points in each object. So if you're familiar to other sort of 3D programs, each object has a pivot point as you move it, and you can select and change the pivot point for each object, so the point that it rotates around. We'll look at these later. These are snapping tools. So when you're aligning another tool to another tool, you can snap, or you can do the angles as well, and you can snap to different 45 degree, 20 degree angles, whatever you decide. These are the aligning tools here. And along here, this is the material editor, which is a much more complex tool we'll look at later when you're finishing off some of your projects. And here is the render tools. So when you finally come to your finished project, you'll be able to set up your render here and render the scene, and it will render in the output. Now, if I just delete these, let's discuss these viewports. So depending on which version of 3ds Max you've got, you might have either one viewport at the start or 4 viewports at the start. It doesn't really matter because you can select viewports by either just pressing Alt and W and it will go to one viewport view, or Alt and W and it will go back to all 4. And which one you click in will be the one you go to. So that one will be the top one. Here would be perspective, front, and back. So that's Alt and W together. So you hold down Alt and press W. And also you can go to here as well. On each of these they've got different views. So if I bring up let's bring up the teapot, and I'll just make a teapot there. And with that teapot you can see the front, the top, the left view there. You can actually change the views by pressing, if I go to Alt and W and I select here in the perspective view, I can now press T to go to top, P perspective, L for left, and F for front. It's interesting to know, if you haven't used a 3D design program before, let me just go back to its original view. If you haven't used a 3D design program before with this sort of layout, if I go back to the 4 view, which is Alt and W, if I was to draw an object in here, you can see the Z and X and Y axis are slightly different in each view, and that when you draw your objects, if I just draw an object in here, say for instance, you can see it down here in this perspective as it's on the side of itself here. So it always depends in which angle you draw it. So that's the top and that's the left. So the X and the Y axis changes depending on which view you're in. In the top left and right they always remain the same, but if you're drawing an object, objects start across the base when you expand them out. So the base in this one here would give us that result. That's something that you'll come to terms with the more you use the program. And there's another ginormous teapot. Okay, let me delete these objects. But anyway, I'm just going to draw a teapot in there again. And what we're going to do is look at some of the other viewpoint options you have as well. For example, here we're in perspective. By bringing up this, we can change it to orthographic, and then back to perspective as well. And you can also have realistic, shaded, constant colors, edged face. Edged face is really important actually. If you press edged face, if you're editing in one of the objects that you've made, if you have edged face objects, then you can see and select which edge you're going to manipulate, and that's important for stuff that we're going to do later on. Let me turn that off. You can also press F4 to bring up edge faced. Make sure that you're selected in the view that you're doing as well, because you can select and change all of the views as well. And F3 will give me just the wireframe or the realistic view. So I can do realistic edged face, F3 wireframe, and so on. Right, let's delete that. So two useful shortcuts for you there is F3 and F4. So F3 goes between the wireframe and the realistic view, and F4 will give you the edged faces or not. There are also some other interesting options here as well. For instance, if I bring up the object like this and say I had two objects, if I highlight one like this and press Z, it will zoom in on that object as well. So it'll just go between the objects that you're selecting. So that's Z as a shortcut. So the shortcuts so far: T for top, P for perspective, L for left, F for front. F3 will change between wireframed and realistic. F4 will change between the edged face and the non-edged face view. And Z, if you select an object by left clicking on it, will go between the two objects that you're selecting, or how many other objects you've got. Now you can actually see the list view as well. If I bring up the list view, you can see that I've got different objects on the stage now. And in fact, I'm just going to delete them all off the stage again. So there we go, and I should have none left.